back to, Moses was brought up in Pharaoh's court, by the way. And so he was educated with the highest education. He was close to the king. By the way, the Pharaoh at the time is the world ruler. He's the empire of the world. It was one of the longest empires of the ancient world, was Egypt. Okay, so Moses is brought up, and he's actually very close to the throne. It was the Pharaoh's daughter that pulls Moses out of the water. By the way, that's what Moses means, right? That he pulled out of the water. And of course, when you begin to, I've shared this before, but when you begin to understand the throne of God, right? And then there's this river, and then there happens to be this tree, right? So we know, because we can read Revelation, that the river of life flows from the throne of God, and on both sides of the river of life is the tree of life. And of course they're always of life, because the life in the tree comes from the throne, and the life in the water comes from the throne. Okay, so in the story of Moses, Pharaoh sends forth his decree that all the firstborn babies die, right? And he tries to get the midwives to destroy the children, but that doesn't happen. Now the point here is that Jochebed takes her son and she places him in a basket, and she places him in the river. And why is she placing him in the river? Because she's placing him in the hands of God. The river comes from the throne of God, and by placing him in the river, she's placing him in the hands of God.
Wow.
Right?
We would think that would be so crazy today.
Yeah, we don't think that way.
Crocodiles.
Right. Yeah, that's right. There's dragons that want to destroy. And so it's interesting, how's there dragons that want to destroy the river of life? So what happens is that this Egyptian, the daughter of Pharaoh, is now bathing in the river, and she sees this basket, and what does she see the baby as?
A beautiful baby.
It's a gift that's come
Gift
from God.
Yeah.
The river comes from the throne of God, and here now she says, so I'm going out of the river. This has come from God. This is Moses. I've drawn this baby out of the river. That's what his name means, right? So he's a gift that's come from God, and she brings him up as her own son.
Did she
So-
think he was a god? Like,
What?
did she think that he was actually descended from a god?
No, I think he was a gift from God.
Okay.
Pharaoh's God, right? So, but the
And that
point
was
is,
his name then?
that's what his name means, Moses.
But was his name Moses before?
Yeah, she
Okay,
calls him Moses.
but before he was found?
What?
Like the mom,
What did Jochebed name the baby?
what did Jochebed?
I
does
think,
it
I
say?
don't know if Moses said, I don't know if it says, I think it just says.
Or was that a pharaoh
They
name?
just have his name, they call his name Moses, but that's what his name literally means, it's just drawn out of the river.
Pretty cool.
Yeah,
But I'm wondering if Pharaoh named him.
I don't know, you could,
Be interesting.
yeah, the Bible, I've never
I'll
heard,
put that on the questions for Moses.
I've never heard another name for Moses, so.
So you
Who
say
named you
Moses
Moses?
named it what?
Moses means I drew him out of the water, I drew him out of the
That's really
river.
cool.
That's what his name means.
That's pretty amazing.
So what happens is that Moses is brought up in this court of Pharaoh, and he learns all the ways of the court of Pharaoh, by the way, which is going to be very significant later, right? That he understands how the kingdom works and how Pharaoh works, because God has a purpose for him, so God's training him for the future, even though Moses doesn't understand it. But when Moses thinks that his way to deliver the Israelites is to start bearing Egyptians, which is a wrong understanding, right? So
Right.
God has to send him out into the wilderness where he can learn about himself and learn about God, right?
So if we just go back up, we talked in another study about the process of coming out of one kingdom going into another.
That's right.
And we were talking about Daniel, Shadrach, and how they were given new names when they were brought into the kingdom. And so, in Exodus 2, it keeps referring to the baby as him. But verse 10, it says, and the child grew, and she, so the mother, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. So he probably had a Hebrew name
He
at
must have
that
had
time.
a Hebrew name.
Right.
And then when he became Pharaoh's daughter, then
He
he took
received.
on.
Right.
Pharaoh's daughter,
Thank you.
son.
And I've never seen another name for him, but thank you,
Oh, that's pretty cool.
yeah. So what's interesting here is that Moses goes through the wilderness experience. By the way, God always sends his people into
Yes,
the
he
wilderness to
does.
grow, right?
Time to think.
And when Moses begins to understand what's going on, then God says, okay, Moses, now you're ready to go back. And what does Moses say?
No, not me.
No, not me. No, the guy that was so anxious to deliver the children of Israel before, and had his own idea about his own way, that he was gonna do it, now he's learned. And he realizes, not me. You mean somebody else, God. I'm not me. Right? So it's very interesting that God gave him some signs. Do you remember?
The rod.
Okay, he gave him the rod that turns into a serpent.
His hand did leprosy when he put it in, pulled it out.
Okay, and very good. And what was the other one?
What about the circumcision thing?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But what's that?
The ones that he's talking about the ones that he was to show the king, the
Yes.
Pharaoh, right?
Right. There was one more.
Throw the staff down and it turned into a serpent.
No, that'll be our next story. But right now, there's three things that God. There's always three. I'm sorry. If you only remember two, there's something's missing. Right? He tells him, he gives him the rod, he tells him throw it down, it turns into a snake, he shows him, he puts his hand in his, he says that if they don't believe these signs, then,
Turn into leprosy.
yeah, right, but the other sign was, if they don't believe these signs, then he talks about turning the water into blood, right? That was the third sign that he was going to give. And of course, we'll begin to see this when we see him talking to Pharaoh.
What's
Now-
the second one?
The rod that he has turns into
Yeah,
a snake.
yeah.
The second one was his hand turns leprous, and then
Oh, yeah.
God restored it. And the third sign was to be the ability to turn water to blood. Now Moses goes back reluctantly to meet with Pharaoh, but before he does that, God sends. Well, I won't get into that kingdom parts yet, but anyway, let's just stick with the story. So he goes back. I'm sorry, it has many levels to it.
Oh, it sounds like it.
So anyways-
That was Exodus 4 verse 9.
Okay.
About the blood and the, yeah. It was,
Very good. So what happens is that Moses goes back to talk to Pharaoh, and I'm sorry, I went to the soccer game to see Jen play. Jen Belovic played tonight, so I came directly from there. I was going to bring my history book, and it has a picture of Pharaoh on it, and it's really cool because Pharaoh has this, the Pharaoh's headdress. They have this headdress,
Yes.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Little pyramids on the side.
And then, yeah, I'll explain to you. But anyways, then there's this hooded serpent coming off his forehead, and there's also a vulture head coming off his forehead, right?
Yeah.
So the point here is that he's the sun god. These are actually shafts of light that are coming from him, right? But he's also the serpent god because these are actually the hood of the cobra as it's expanding. But he's also, because he's the sun god and he's the serpent god, he's also the source of life from water, right? So this idea in the ancient world, when spring came and the river overflooded its banks, they saw as a serpent that had gotten wings, and this serpent with wings is now flooding the land, right? So it's all this neat imagery follows this king.
What you call God of water?
What's that?
Did you say he was the God, sun god, serpent god,
And he's the source of water, the source of the water of life. So you remember the river
Source
of
of
life
life,
flows from the
yeah.
throne.
Yeah.
Always. So what happens is that you see on Pharaoh's head, and I'm sorry for the terrible picture, but the idea is that there's this serpent, there's this cobra head sticking out of Pharaoh's head, right? And so Moses walks into Pharaoh's court, right? And he says, I'm come from God, and God says, let my people go, right?
Right.
So
Opposing.
So the question is, who is truly the king? Who's truly the source of life, right? Who is truly the sun god? Who is truly the serpent god? Who is truly, right? So this is the battle that's going on that we call the plagues. But this is the battle is over the kingship. So what does Moses do with his rod?
Drops it.
He drops it down, right? And it becomes a
Snake.
it becomes a snake. Well, then Pharaoh has some magicians, and they do the same thing, right? They drop their rods and it becomes a snake. So then what happens?
Then it swallows up the other snakes.
So Moses' rod, snake, swallows up the other snakes. Must have been a full snake when it was done, huh? And then he picks it back up and he's standing there. No, so what's going on in the story?
He's conquering the other
Yeah,
gods.
it's more powerful.
Right. So the point is, here's Moses sitting in front of this king with this serpent thing sticking out of his forehead, because who's the serpent god?
Pharaoh.
He's claiming that he is. But then what just happened? Who's the serpent god?
The God of heaven.
The God of heaven.
True God.
Now this conflict is going to continue throughout the plagues. Of course, you know that the first one, the one we call the first plague, is the one he turns the water to blood. He turns the water to blood. And so here's Moses goes to confront Pharaoh when he goes out by the river. Because why is Pharaoh going to the river? Well, because
It's the source.
that's the sort. He's the river god. The river of Nile, the river of life, comes out. That's Pharaoh's responsibility. It flows from him. The reason that the Egyptians have life is because of the river of life that comes from Pharaoh, right? So Moses confronts Pharaoh and it says again, let my people go. And because he doesn't, then he says that the water will turn to blood. And so the water turns to blood. By the way, what does the magicians do?
Same thing.
Same thing. So the interesting part of the story is that who asked who about changing the water so it's not blood? Who does that? Can the magicians do that? No, it's Pharaoh. I mean, it's Moses. Pharaoh has to ask Moses, and you'll notice throughout the plagues, Pharaoh has to ask Moses to reverse. So it's interesting. Janus and Jambres and the magicians of Pharaoh can bring about the negative, but they can't stop the negative and bring things back to order. Now that's significant in the story because the king is the standard. He's the one that brings order to the realm. He's the source of stability. So the very fact that Pharaoh has to keep asking Moses to reverse the plague is just so much overwhelming evidence that God is saying to Pharaoh, you are not God, I'm God. Right? And that Moses is my messenger, and you should listen to what he has to say. Now, we tend to think of Pharaoh as being pretty stupid, right? Because he's so stubborn, and he won't give in, that he's not God, right? But of course, really, the story's talking about who?
Us.
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 God keeps showing us
Right.
that we're not God,
We're not God.
that we're not in control of our own lives,
That's right.
that we don't know what we know, we don't bring stability, our ideas don't work. Every time we try to fix something, we make it. God keeps showing us, and we say, "Oh, Pharaoh, he's so dumb. He should have just submitted to God." And God's saying, "Yeah, hello, I'm telling you the story because."
Yeah.
Right? So it's interesting when you go through the plagues, there's this process. All the plagues deal with Egyptian gods, and all of those Egyptian gods, as we notice from the story of Nebuchadnezzar the tree, all those Egyptian gods and their concepts of God, all those gods were under the rulership of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the head god, and so all these are different aspects of the Egyptian gods. It's a very interesting study to do that. But so the idea, I won't get too deep into the plagues, but you'll notice the first couple plagues, Janus and Jambres and the magicians, they mimic, they copy them. But when it comes to the plague of
The gnats.
the gnats, then the magicians say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. I love that. This is the fingerprint of God. Right? So I know this comes from God.
Creation.
This is not, they can't copy that. So it's interesting. Oh, but what's the last one they copied? Do you remember?
It's the blood. No. It was the snakes. Blood.
Frogs?
Frog.
It's the frog. Yeah. By the way, that's significant if you're reading Revelation. In
Because
Revelation,
3 frogs come out of the mouth.
Revelation 16 talks about the frogs that come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. What it's actually telling you is that that's the last time that Satan can counterfeit God, what God is doing. That's the last mimic that Satan's kingdom will do. Because he's actually going to have this false spiritual movement that's going to resemble
Mirror.
right, sorry. But it's not the truth. What's that?
Which one was that in Revelation?
Revelation 16, we're talking about the 7 last plagues, remember?
Yeah, I know that.
Three frogs come out of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. That's actually comes from this story. That's the last one that Satan can counterfeit or mimic what God is doing. After that, then the plagues, and they realize it's the finger of God. So anyway, it comes from the story. But so the point is, you'll notice when it gets to the end of the plague, and he starts getting serious, then he's going to deal with the last 2 remaining things of the plagues. Remember what the 9th plague is? The 9th plague is actually starts dealing with darkness. Right? And of course, he's dealing with darkness because who's claiming to be the sun god? Well, Pharaoh is, right? And then the last one is the plague of the firstborn. So you're actually dealing with the prince of Egypt and his son, the son of the king, right? So these the 9th and the 10th plague really reiterate to Pharaoh that he's messing with God, right? And of course, after the 10th plague, then there's a cry throughout Egypt to let the people go, right? So what you see in the story of Egypt and this conflict is you see a battle over the kingship, and you see God relating to people in language that they can understand, so that they can realize who the true king is, right? Now I mentioned the plagues in Egypt, so I've also mentioned the plagues in Revelation. Many times people don't understand the symbolism of the plagues.
Right.
Okay, so many people are looking for literal things to happen, rather than realizing that God is going to speak to this world in language that this world can understand, to show them that He's God and you are not.
Right.
And He's going to make that very plain to us, right? And it's going to become very painful as our world falls apart. I don't know if you had that experience in your own life. Your world falls apart. You begin to realize, oh, I'm not so good at being God. Maybe I should give up my control of my life to God and let Him be God. Well, the same process is going to happen. Is happening in our society, and it's going to happen in our world. And this is going to be a worldwide process, right? And so the 7 last plagues are actually describing this process where God shows the world that they're not in control, that they don't have the answers, that everything they do does not work, that nature's going to fall apart, society's going to fall apart, everything's going to fall apart, and they need to turn to God instead of turning to their own ideas. And then, of course, there's more to it than that. But the point here is that many times people don't understand the plagues. But anyway, that's a different study. But it's actually a very interesting study. So these are the ideas in the Bible that show us the centrality, the importance of the king. The kingship is so critical. And who the king is, who your king is, determines what kingdom you belong, and determines what kind of character you're going to form. We talk about understanding the character of God, or the twisting of the character of God. Like some of the teachings that are important to us, like a correct definition of hell. Correct definition of understanding what hell really is important, because if you believe that God's putting people in this fire and burning them forever and ever and ever and ever and ever because they messed up, well, what's your picture of God?
Exactly.
Yeah. Is this loving, kind Heavenly Father you're talking about? Right? Right. So the point is, what happens is when Satan has given false teaching to twist the picture of the character of God, what happens is, if that's the kind of God that I worship, then that's the kind of character that I form. So if I believe that God just kicks people around, well, then what am I going to be doing? If I believe that God is unforgiving and very uncompassionate, then what kind of person do I become?
Exactly.
So what happens is that we form characters after our ideas or the pictures of who we worship. We're changed into the likeness of that which we behold, right? So the idea is if I have a clear picture of God, if I have a true picture of God, then I am able to form a character in harmony with his character. But if I have a twisted picture of God, then I form a twisted character. And that's what you see a lot of what's going on in our world, and you see it throughout history in terms of religion. People have this twisted idea about what God's like, so they become these religious zealots doing all kinds of crazy things in the name of God, something God would never do, right?
Yeah.
So the king is the standard. He's the what everything is measured by, and that's why I like to use the menorah's idea, because it's just so beautiful. It's so simple yet it's so profound. So Jesus is the standard by which everything will be measured.
Amen.
Okay? No one gets in the kingdom of God unless they reflect his character. By the way, that's what it means to receive his name. Okay? Is your name written in the book? Well, the book's already been written. And what's the book written about?
King.
The character of the king. And the question is your name in the book? Is your character in the book? In other words, have you formed a character in harmony with the king's character? Because all that's in the book is a revelation of the king's character. If you resemble him, then your name's in the book. If you don't look like him and act like him and talk like him and function like him, then your name's not in the book.
But we can't do that for ourselves.
Oh, of course not.
No,
And you were never created to do that by yourself,
that's right.
right?
Well,
You're-
we were
you're-
actually,
You're dependent.
originally,
You're created to what?
reflect the character of
Right,
God.
yes,
Originally.
but you were created to reflect his by being dependent, totally dependent upon
On
him.
him.
Never
on
the
ourselves.
idea of doing it on your own,
Yeah.
right? That was some crazy idea that some creature came up with.
Some snake.
Yeah, that we listened to.
Snake in the grass.
So you can see, you can start to see, even talking about the Bible stories, and then we even jumped into some of the prophecy and Revelation, different places where you can begin to see that the stories make much more sense when we understand them from a biblical perspective, and they actually give us some insights. And then we start seeing some of the prophecies in the Bible that are actually telling us, come from the story, start telling us something that we can start penetrating, we can start seeing what the prophet was actually trying to say, rather than, trying to wonder, what does this mean? What does that mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is, kind of why I try to go into the kingdom dynamics to kind of give this, and then when you start studying, you start comparing the scripture to scripture, you start seeing, your eyes will start opening, and you'll start seeing patterns, processes of patterns. The Exodus story, by the way, just continues, and there's a lot more levels to it, but I think that is beautiful. And any questions so far what we talked about tonight?